Thanks very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from sunny Valencia. So I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about these questions around the relationship between technology and the workplace, and actually, the more I think about it, it's not new, really, because actually we've seen that every new technology that's come along in history has changed the way we work. So the fact that most of us, at least until recently, were probably working in offices, is down to a whole range of technological innovations that we've had over the past 100 years. Whether it's electrification, transport, elevators, pretty sort of basic invention, but made a huge difference, because then you can have skyrise buildings and office blocks. Telecommunications mean you can have forms of remote working. And, let's not forget that, at one time, way back in recent, not recent history, distant history, most people worked from home, right? You had artisan working, and it was only with the rise of the factory system that we all began to sort of move towards kind of more collaborative types of work. So the point here is that we shouldn't be surprised that every technology that comes along changes the why, what, where, and how of work, as you sort of outlined earlier. And if we look at the technologies that we've got now, machine learning, virtual reality, I mean, these technologies are so powerful that it's simply unavoidable that they're going to have a really transformative impact on how we work. So that's a little bit of sort of context. I mean, if we look at the impact of technology on the workplace now, I actually see kind of two phases of technology evolution that we're going through at the moment. The first is, what happened during the pandemic. And, I think this aligns with, some of the trends that Daniel was talking about, that, the pandemic was obviously an unprecedented situation for most enterprises and most workers. We haven't had anything in, living memory. And clearly, enterprises had to move quickly. They had to move to remote working. They had to enforce social distancing. The impact of that varied a lot depending on the type of industry. Some found it easier than others. But clearly, there was a massive call upon technology in order to kind of save the day in terms of working. So we saw a massive shift to cloud computing. I mean, surprisingly, there were a lot of even large enterprises that weren't using cloud computing before the pandemic. And now actually most of them have actually moved to the clouds. We saw a huge surge in workplace communication platforms, Zoom, Teams, Workspace, all of those sort of platforms, massive sort of demand for new forms of platforms to get workers communicating better. We saw an increased role for conversational AI. A lot of enterprises were facing a kind of a deluge of inquiries from employees around policies, around sickness, around time off, couldn't cope, use the conversational AI. So these were, to a certain extent, not necessarily quick fixes, but they were a response to the immediate sort of pressures and situation that many enterprises found themselves in. And as a result of that, as you mentioned, we've now moved generally much more towards hybrid models of working. And, that works really well for some enterprises. It works really well for some workers. For others, it doesn't work as well. So I think the reality that we're facing now, that many enterprises and workers are facing, is that although the current model of remote working kind of works in a way, it's not really optimal for a lot of enterprises, and indeed for a lot of workers. There's something missing in the current model of hybrid working. And if you delve into the research, you find that actually a lot of it's down to the loss of kind of collaboration the loss of kind of spontaneity, the kind of the lack of interaction that you typically have in a traditional kind of hybrid or remote working setup. Interestingly, this isn't just coming from employers. It's also coming, as your research shows, it's also coming from at least some of the workforce as well, because there's actually a lot of research that many workers actually struggle with traditional remote working, because of the isolation, because there isn't a clear demarcation between home and office life, all of these pressures. So what I would say is the current model is, of remote working, hybrid working, clearly, it's helped to save the day, but it's not the long term. I think everyone agrees it's long term, it's not optimally. So that's where the metaverse comes in as a potential, I don't want to say solution, I think it's part of the solution to this question of how we get to a more sustainable hybrid model of working. Now, many of you may have heard about the metaverse. You might have some idea what it is. It's essentially a virtual reality version of the internet. So it uses technologies like virtual reality, machine learning, blockchain, digital currencies to create quite interactive environments in which you can buy goods or services, or you can collaborate with your colleagues. There isn't one metaverse at the moment. A lot of people think there is, but actually there's hundreds of different metaverses. One of the things we've seen, and which prompted my article in the Harvard Business Review, was increasingly we're seeing a number of companies and startups, and indeed large companies, create metaverse-based workplaces. So using the basic technology of the metaverse to create a more immersive environment. So in the metaverse, you have your own avatar. You can sort of personalize that. You can move around your office. You can see the office layout. You can have virtual meetings. You can see your colleagues. You can see where they are, if they're in a meeting or at their desk. You can do virtual presentations. You can also change the office environment. So it doesn't have to be a sort of a corporate environment. It could be, as you mentioned in the quote at the start, it could be a beachside location, could be a space station, it could be something that's quite sort of quirky. So there's a lot of scope for experimentation. It's, I'm not saying it's as good as the real thing. That's clearly not the case. But it's something that can actually introduce that kind of element of surprise and curiosity into the workforce. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the metaverse. I think there are sort of three big advantages of metaverse-based workplaces. The first is spontaneity. There's actually been quite a lot of academic research which shows that up to 90% of business communications are actually spontaneous communications, spontaneous conversations. So, that kind of water cooler moment, you bump into someone, you have a good discussion, you have an idea that leads to something. Particularly in research and development environments, that as spontaneity is hugely important. And that is something that we're seeing as a driver of the metaverse, because it does enable these kind of bump-in experiences. So, my avatar can bump into you, at the water cooler, we can have a conversation. So it's trying to kind of replicate that kind of immersive, collaborative environment. So that's one big advantage. The second is around learning. Training is completely different in the metaverse. It's much more visual and interactive. So, and this is where we actually already see a lot of applications. So you can imagine an engineer who's being trained to operate a particular machine in a factory. And what you can do is you can overlay a kind of a virtual machine on top of the actual machine, and you can have step-by-step instructions. And again, there's a lot of research that people learn more effectively when it's done visually, and when it's sort of learning by doing, as opposed to kind of conventional textbook or classroom education. There are some really cool examples. You can find them in the article where medical students are being trained on 3D anatomical models. They can actually move the models. And again, if you can compare that with a traditional textbook, it's a world of difference. So, there's so many kind of examples here. So this is something that's already happening. Gamification is another big advantage. Actually, a lot of the metaverse technology comes from the gaming world, where you can sort of compete, win prizes. And what that means is that you can increasingly make training more of a game. So, you can have rewards, you can set training goals as a challenge, as a quest. And, even if it's just kind of getting a burst of confetti when you get to the next level, that's kind of motivating for a lot of people, because you feel you're getting somewhere. And then sort of finally, and obviously there's a lot more in the article, the metaverse will also allow us increasingly to have digital colleagues, digital humans. So it won't be just our avatars, but we'll have AI-enabled assistants that can do tasks for us. Yeah, so learn from us. There's some. This is already happening, right? So there's some great examples where you can have an AI mortgage advisor, an AI chief economist that can do some routine discussions with clients. Again, as I say, this is all technology that's kind of happening. It's not widespread, but it's being demonstrated to be possible. So that's a very kind of broad sort of take. And I would conclude by saying, technology and the metaverse, it's certainly not the whole solution. It's certainly not a silver bullet. You're going to need to have a lot of changes, which will be sort of cultural and, architectural. It requires a multidimensional solution. I do think some of the technologies, particularly, do have a role, and an increasingly important role to play in really getting us to a better model of hybrid working.